Thank you very much indeed, Nick. And thank you to Radius for the invitation to be their patron and the invitation to be with you for this weekend. I want to speak a little bit about both the practical and the moral and spiritual problems of creating a character. By what imaginable right does any creature seek to create a character? There's a kind of initial frisson that ought to strike us about the presumption of improving on God's creation by putting into it the extra bits which we think God might have left out. And later on I'll have a little bit to say about the theological dimensions of this. But don't worry, that will come quite a bit later. And first I want to look at how some of these problems come across when we actually look at the practice of drama itself. You won't be surprised, in the light of the introduction, that I'll have a little bit to say about Shakespeare en route, and I trust you'll bear with me if I bang that drum with enthusiasm. But I'm going to start with another writer, a very distinguished, complex, and enriching writer of the last generation, and that is Iris Murdoch, several of whose novels have been described as Shakespearean in some of their dimensions. The novel I have in mind is the one which actually won the Booker Prize in its time, The Sea, which some of you at least will have read. I see some nods around the church. And you remember, those of you who've read it, that the central character is a would-be retired theatrical director. I say would-be retired because it's not at all clear that he's letting go of very much. He thinks he is, but part of the force and energy of the book is exploring just how hard it is for him to stop being a director in every sense, and a dramaturge in every sense. As the novel unfolds, we see not only something of his past life as a theatrical director, but some of the impact that his styles of direction have had on those around him. He hasn't just produced plays. He has in many ways tried to conscript a lot of the people around him into dramas, deciding who they are, what they're going to be, what their relation to him is going to be. He's a controlling character, a profoundly imaginative character who is also deeply deficient in self-knowledge. And that background helps to explain how, in the novel, when he quite unexpectedly meets up with a childhood sweetheart, he seeks to cast her afresh in a drama. She is surely still really in love with him, and can't surely be in love with the rather dim and coarse character she's elected to marry. And so the plot ratchets up with a great deal of tension. Charles ends up, in effect, kidnapping this woman, trying to persuade her that the role she was born to play is the role of his beloved. I won't spoil the book for you by explaining the various comic and actually deeply tragic events that unfold from this. But it's a long meditation, you might say, on the nature of not so much drama itself as the dramatist's point of view and the dramatic director's point of view. There is always an issue of power in theatre. Those who ever written or ever directed drama will be aware, of course, that this is built into how drama works. You write lines for other people to speak, and that's a pretty naked exercise of power. You tell people what to say and where and how, and that too is a very naked exercise of power. Writing at slightly greater length on this recently, I decided to give the essay the title Power and Performance, because power is really bound in with performance. So, one of the things which is going on in Charles's adventures in Iris Murdoch's novel, a dimension which I'll be saying a bit more about as the time goes on, one of the things that's going on is that Charles is repeatedly seeking to write the script for those around him in a way that is deeply in conflict with where they are actually coming from, with the time they have already lived through. He wants to adjust, adapt, sometimes cancel the passage of time in other people's lives, so that his own script takes over as if with a blank sheet. But in fact, of course, everything we say about human character is in some sense about the real passage of time. We become who we are, and we become who we are in the exchanges and encounters with others that shape us. We don't, I think most people would agree, we don't enter this world with a ready-made character which we then proceed to act out for the next 80-odd years. We are constantly, subtly adjusting, growing, adapting, advancing, retreating, in the complex dance of relationship with all those around us. We are listening and we are speaking. We are learning how to speak by how we listen. We are learning how to speak by how we listen. And that is how we grow as persons. And that tells us something about how we might try to represent character in the dramatic context without, it's to be hoped, falling victim to the distortions of supposing that, like Charles, we can in fact write a comprehensive fiction drawing in the lives of all those around us. The writer of fiction, in the sense of novels, is doing this with a little bit more help than the dramatist has. The writer of fiction can fill in the background a bit. The writer of fiction can put in brackets that you can read if you want to. You can't do brackets in drama. I'm looking at those who write drama and suspect that they would agree with this. You can't take for granted that people will look at the footnotes. And you can't spend too much time in drama filling in a backstory, as we say. So drama really poses quite a problem about how you represent that kind of passage of time that creates something looking incredibly like character. Dramatic fiction, the making up of stories that you act on stage, has to be performed. And so that compounds the problem, as it does in Iris Murdoch's novel. So that's the kind of territory within which I want to think out loud with you a bit this afternoon. What's going on when dramatists seek to construct character, dramatists rather than novelists? What are the challenges and the possibilities? And what do we learn about the religious and the spiritual dimension of character and identity through looking at some of these things? Now, if it's true that character is created in exchange and encounter, then in drama, character is created through the exchange of words. In a drama, you're creating a timeline of conversation, which is rather different from a backstory. You may have flashbacks, and more in a lot of contemporary drama. Upsetting a linear time sequence is one of the things you do to show you're on top of things. But nonetheless, when you are actually confronted with a scene on stage, the elaboration of character depends on what people say to each other. You're trying to embody the ways in which selves define themselves in exchange, the exchange of words. And thinking about one of the purest examples of this in 20th century drama, it is quite unimaginable to think of a backstory for the characters in, let's say, Waiting for Godot. Where do they come from and why are they like this? Don't ask. Don't go there. What is before you is the construction of character in those words and those interactions that are there and now. And what is remarkable about that play is how much developmental tension can arise with these bafflingly context-free characters that face you on stage. It's almost a kind of, what should I say, a controlled experiment in how far you can go with context-free dramatis personae. But that in turn suggests that when you begin trying to construct character in drama, the worst possible place to start is to know what a character is like and what they're going to say. Now, I don't mean by this that you simply put down a name and then start scribbling at random. It does mean that while beginning with a drama you may have a rough sense of where people fit on a kind of narrative map, when they actually appear and open their mouths, you mustn't, so to speak, fill those mouths with your material too rapidly. They have to speak and then they have to be spoken to. They have to speak and they have to be listened to. They have to listen and they have to respond. And if you're really trying to construct a proper kind of verbal tension in the drama, then you will always be listening, and I would underline that word listening for what others can say to a character that will prod them, that will move them forward and break the shell a bit. And that's a roundabout way of saying that dramatic characters, when they're doing their job, can't simply be puppets. They can't simply ventriloquize a position that you have laid out for them. You can't begin by saying, well, here's the drama, and so is going to stand for this point of view, and therefore will all through be speaking from this point of view. You end up with effectively a row of people talking to an audience, rather than talking to one another, and shaping and shifting each other in that process. I have a lot of admiration and even some affection for some of the plays of George Bernard Shaw, but I think a lot of you will know what I mean if I say that Shaw's great temptation, to which he regularly and gleefully succumbs, is something a little bit like the row of people talking out to the audience, rather than shaping one another. When they change, when they develop, it always seems a bit arbitrary. But what they're really there for is to tell you lots about what George Bernard Shaw thinks. So, the puppet option, that is, the character who simply is a mouthpiece for a position, especially for your own position as writer, is the one in whom these paradoxes and challenges about power most come home to roost. Because if you're really interested in creating character, I think what you have to do is to seek to create a shared language, not just one person's speech, but a language that is held in common among the speakers. But a shared language is a language in which people disagree, explore, discuss, develop. When you imagine a shared language, you imagine real differences and the creation of real tension and risk in relationships. The to and fro of ordinary speech may shatter the plans you started with, the plans for coherent narratives and self-contained characterization. And that may happen in both tragic and comic mode. As soon as you give yourself to the process of fleshing out on a stage the real tensions and interactions of common speech, the more readily you will be letting go of the puppet mentality. The more, to introduce my second word in the title, the more you will be inviting a certain kind of rebellion in your characters, and I'll explain a bit what I mean by that shortly. So, thus far, we began by recognizing some of the moral, spiritual, and even theological questions that lie in the background of creating character. What does it actually mean? Have we the right to do it? How do we avoid the seductions of power, modelling a kind of control over others, even imagined others, which is fundamentally very bad for everybody around? And then, what is it to construct character? I've suggested it's to construct conversation, to construct the common language in which people disagree, negotiate, discover, and move on. And if that's the case, then we are already building in the very business of constructing drama, an element of the unknown, that which may derail what we thought we wanted to say. It's not unique to drama. More than one poet has said, "I don't know what I want to say until I see what I've said." How can I know what I think until I see what I say? Said Saunders Lewis, one of the great 20th century Welsh poets and dramatists. And that willingness to be derailed, that willingness to take the conversation and the relationship away from what at first seemed obvious, is perhaps one of the marks of the most durable and the most penetrating kinds of drama. So naturally, this is the point at which I begin to talk about Shakespeare. King Lear is probably the most discussed of Shakespeare's plays, perhaps along with Hamlet, but there's still a formidable body of literature about it. And one of the things that ought to keep puzzling us about King Lear is why Shakespeare changed the story. If you look at Shakespeare's sources for many of his plays, you can see that probably in 4 cases out of 5, the rough outline of the story sticks with the original. There was really a Macbeth who really killed a King Duncan and really was dethroned by King Duncan's son. And Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are not granted the option of retiring to a golf club in Inverness. But the strange thing about King Lear is that it started life as a story with a happy ending. In the original story of Lear, in the Chronicles of Geoffrey of Monmouth from the 12th century, the ancient British king Lear and his daughter Cordelia, or Corella, in Geoffrey's original, actually win at the end, and Lear retains his throne and spends his last years happily winding down, just as he wants to in Shakespeare's play. What possessed Shakespeare to change the story? A story not unfamiliar to his audience. If you can imagine the first audiences of King Lear, you have to imagine people who think they know where this is going. They will have noticed that it's called a tragedy. And they will doubtless have thought, well, lots of sad and difficult things are going to happen in this. But King Lear, wasn't that the chap who got his throne back after his daughter intervened? So, enter Lear with Cordelia dead in his arms is a rather shocking stage direction, then as now. And I ask myself, at what point did Shakespeare realise that the way he was telling this story was making a happy ending impossible? Because I think that's the kind of question that as a dramatist he must have asked himself. He had created, in those characters of Lear and Cordelia, people whose hearts and minds and selves had been stretched to breaking point in any number of ways. He'd given them a brief moment of reunion and reconciliation, a brief and, I would say, almost unfairly tantalizing moment when you think if there were a happy ending, that would be it. And, oh, it isn't. There's lots of pages left. There's another half hour in the theatre. As if, at that point, Shakespeare said to himself something like, the amount of pain I've given these people to bear in the drama, encoded in the exchanges, the relations between them that I've mapped out, is too heavy for the drama itself to resolve. And accordingly, he kills his two characters. As if the very way in which he's allowed their relationship to evolve, along with all the other relationships and all the other exchanges of power and exercises of evil in the play, as if that's too much now to turn back to a consoling ending. This is bad. You're not going to be allowed to forget that it is bad. And no amount of smoothing it over at the end is going to make this all right. And so I envisage Shakespeare, after he's reconciled and reunited Lear and Cordelia, almost saying to us as an audience, that was beautiful, wasn't it? Now I'm going to kill them. And is the beauty still there? Because the pain is still there. Your work as audience is to decide whether the beauty or the pain carries more weight in the longest of long runs. But I, as dramatist, am not going to give you any shortcuts for that. So, I don't know. I'm speculating about what Shakespeare might have thought he was doing in King Lear. Creating characters whose suffering is so intense, whose darkness is so dark, that he knows there is no narrative way out in the terms he has set up. That doesn't, I hasten to add, that doesn't make Lear a nihilistic or anti-theistic play or anything like that. It's to do with what happens with these characters when they are brought into that kind of relationship in that kind of context. But let's turn to a completely different example of Shakespeare's rebellious art. Again, I ask myself, at what point in writing the Henry IV plays did Shakespeare realise that Sir John Falstaff was getting away from the plot? This is moving from the tragic to the comic, if you like. At what point did Shakespeare realise that this fairly minor character, originally it seems intended as a mildly satirical portrait of a rather self-righteous aristocrat of the 14th century, at what point did Shakespeare think, I'm going to give Falstaff just a little bit more space here? And the result is, instead of that minor satirical portrait, John Falstaff becomes the embodiment of a kind of moral and linguistic chaos and excess. Suddenly, he's all over the place. His physical fatness is a kind of embodiment, if you like, of his excessiveness in speech and behaviour. I don't at all go along with Harold Bloom's notorious argument that in creating Falstaff, Shakespeare created the very idea of human character. To be honest, I think that's pretentious nonsense. But what is going on clearly in the play is that Shakespeare has, could we say, fallen for Falstaff. The exchanges between Falstaff and Prince Hal and Falstaff and the Chief Justice and Falstaff and Justice Shallow and all those other unforgettable vignettes of Falstaff mean that the character is gathering momentum and gathering substance with every scene in which he appears. Falstaff's role, Falstaff's typical modes of interaction with those around him, are not all that material to the plot. You can have a perfectly coherent Henry IV Part 1 and Part 2 without Falstaff's more extravagant speeches and actions. You could have quite a lot of time cut if you removed the Gad's Hill robbery and Falstaff's engagements in the Battle of Shrewsbury, to take just two obvious examples. But what's going on is that Falstaff, prodded into life by those around him and prodding them into life, has created a kind of momentum in which excess overflowing, the abundance of character, has taken over. The time that the play takes with Falstaff means that a character who might have been simply a minor player becomes a dominant, perhaps the dominant presence in those two remarkable plays. And Falstaff also seems to infect other people in the plays with something of this rather chaotic and overabundant style. If we move on, of course, to Pistol in Henry V, we see Pistol as a slightly cut-price version of Falstaff's extravagance. The extravagance here turned into technique and a rather shallow and empty braggadocio. Pistol is Falstaff almost without the gusto. But you can even see it in what remains one of my favourite scenes from those plays, and that is Falstaff's conversation with Justice Shallow, where Shallow's meandering, half-senile reminiscences of their disreputable student days in London once again seem to gather a kind of momentum of their own. And Shallow's scattered and clearly wildly inaccurate recollections of what life was like at the Inns of Court 40 or 50 years before once again become a kind of excess, a kind of character development in the presence of Falstaff's extravagance and boundarylessness. Shallow himself takes on something of that same character, though he's, as the name might suggest, he's not a character of much substance. But he too rebels in his own maundering way. And when I read those characterizations, Falstaff and Pistol and Shallow, I think anachronistically of what you might call the Dickensian streak in Shakespeare, where the sheer extravagance of character becomes almost an end in itself. Dickens lets it run away with him all the time. Shakespeare's a bit more controlled. But going back to my basic model, what happens as different characters speak and listen can sometimes accelerate to such a degree that the characters themselves overrun the boundaries you might expect for them. And just as I can, as I say, imagine Shakespeare thinking about what he had loaded onto Lear and Cordelia and thinking, I can't do a happy ending, I can imagine him at some moment in the composition of the Henry IV plays thinking, I've loaded too much onto Falstaff to brush him aside. He has to have, up to the very last moment, and that's a significant thing, up to the very last moment, I'm going to give him his head. I'm not going to stop him being outrageous and disproportionate. And that, of course, gives to the final rejection of Falstaff by the young Henry V its thunderclap quality, and gives Falstaff the one moment of real, indisputable dignity, you might say, that he possesses in the plays, where he turns to Shallow and says, I owe you £1,000, and fades from the story. At least on stage we have that wonderful description in Henry V of his deathbed, which is told in true Falstaffian style. Mistress Quickly, with all her malapropisms and her clichés, describing a very poignant moment, but she too going beyond the requirements of a play which is supposed to be about international politics. And Shakespeare, it seems, can't quite let go, not only of the character he's created in Falstaff, but of the very process of character making. In fact, Falstaff can't just fade at the end of Henry IV. He must die, and his death must be narrated in Falstaffian style, with full absurdity by Mistress Quickly. And those of you who know that passage well will know the wonderful blend of absurdity and poignancy that resides in that speech. More could be said, of course, of the ways in which, in different plays, Shakespeare likes to mess around with verbal extravagance, with outrageousness and nonsense. Characters like Holofernes in Love's Labour's Lost and Dogberry in Much Ado About Nothing, butchering the King's English in various ways. Again, rebels whose excess of speech has somehow been generated, pushed into existence by the exchanges, the speaking and the listening going on around them. And my third Shakespearean example is actually Hamlet. In another of her novels, The Black Prince, Iris Murdoch reflects, or her narrator reflects, on the figure of Hamlet as a figure composed, you might say, composed entirely of words. When Polonius says, "What do you read, my lord?" and Hamlet says, "Words, words, words." There's a sense in which Hamlet is words, words, words. He keeps talking. He is, Iris Murdoch has some wonderful images about this, he is language itself, reflecting on itself. He is making himself up out of words again and again and again. And language is so subtle, so alive in Shakespeare's hands that, as Iris Murdoch's narrator says, language makes jokes in its sleep. But what's going on in Hamlet is, among many other things, the fact that Hamlet is refusing to play. The story is set up as if it's going to be a nice, safe revenge tragedy. Hamlet's uncle kills Hamlet's father, so Hamlet needs to kill Hamlet's uncle. Solid stuff. A good, robust, melodramatic plot. You can dress it up with various things, as the original story does. If there was an earlier Hamlet play by Thomas Kyd, which most people think there was, then it may very well have been at that kind of level. But it's almost as though Hamlet is saying to Shakespeare's audience, you know, we've all seen enough revenge tragedies, and I'm damned if I'm going to be a character in a revenge tragedy. I'm going to make it much more complicated. And Hamlet resists and resists and resists being pushed into the role of the hero of a revenge tragedy. He is rebelling. And that, of course, is part of what gives the play its tension and its energy. It's as if Hamlet is saying to himself, if I keep talking, I won't get trapped in this script that everybody else is trying to push me into. If I keep talking, keep thinking, keep making it complicated, I can avoid the narrow, controlled path of being the hero of a revenge tragedy. And so a simple plot of revenge is spectacularly derailed and unravelled by Hamlet's continual conversation with others and with himself. And while at the end, what do you know, he does kill his uncle, it's at the end of so convoluted, derailed, distracted a plot that it's a rare viewer of Hamlet who can give you a very coherent summary of what actually happens in Hamlet. What's the plot of Hamlet? You could summarize it in a single brief sentence. Or you could spend 4 hours, as Shakespeare does, refusing to give you a plot summary. So again, what I see happening there is the creation of a character who ends up rebelling. Obviously, it's a metaphor, but Shakespeare, by setting up conversations and relations, exchanges and encounters of sufficient depth and energy in the play itself, manages to create, to spin out of his own insides, a new kind of drama. This is not just another revenge tragedy. It's something completely different, which, at the end of the day, comes to be a reflection, as R.S. Murdoch's character says, on language itself and identity itself. And we remember from Hamlet, of course, Hamlet is full of quotations, as people often like to say, we remember from Hamlet at least as much those moments of baffled introspection as we remember the drama of the last 10 minutes or so of the play. Well, lots more could be said, needless to say, about Hamlet and about Shakespeare in general, but I've taken those examples of Lear and Falstaff and Hamlet to illustrate a bit of what I mean by the notion of the character as a rebel. The Shakespearean character who can't be categorized and pigeonholed from their first appearance because they have to grow through the arc of the drama itself. But that dramatic arc, if you put enough energy and variety, enough real opposition and tension into it, will in fact fill out the character in ways you may never have anticipated. I don't think that Shakespeare necessarily began writing Henry IV Part 1 and saying to himself, I know, I'll give them a comic fat knight who's a bit over the top in what he says. I think Shakespeare worked up bit by bit to the extraordinary, exhilarating possibilities of a character emerging in the very tensions and toing and froing of speech and action within the play. I'm not even sure that in Hamlet he started out by saying, I'm going to create a myth of the modern psyche. I think he more likely found himself saying, any fool can write a revenge tragedy, but I'm not any fool. Let's see what happens if this is not such a straightforward plot as you might want it to be. Rebels rather than puppets. Because in these instances, I think we see how the real time-taking of drama pushes the shape of character and therefore plot because of the need to go on imagining the exchange of language which really shifts, opposes, interrogates. And the dramatist who is prepared to let that process unfold in its own time, within the constraints of the drama that they're writing, that's the dramatist who is letting go and becoming much more morally interesting, and the dramatist who is dramatizing a set of positions or preordained relationships. That's, of course, where R.S. Murdoch's Charles in the Sea fails, because he constantly wants to go back to the position of control. And it's where Shakespeare's last and most searching reflection on the nature of dramatic control sort of succeeds. I'm thinking there of the character of Prospero, of course, in The Tempest. Often, in an almost commonplace way, regarded as a sort of self-portrait of the ageing Shakespeare. But certainly, a character who has been very consciously orchestrating the events of the play. At almost every point, you can say Prospero is in charge of what is unfolding. It turns out, in fact, that he's not nearly as much in charge as he thinks he is. Nonetheless, his modus operandi, as you could say, is very much bound up with the idea that he has the responsibility of bringing about a tidy moral conclusion to his own traumatic experience and a set of appropriate rewards and punishments for those around. Yet, as I say, he's not as much in charge as he realizes. What can he do about that? There's an extraordinary moment late in The Tempest where Prospero, speaking to Ariel, is thinking out loud about the punishment of his murderous brother. Can he forgive that brother? And suddenly he turns to Ariel and says, in effect, well, what about this forgiveness then? And Ariel says, I would, sir, were I human. And Prospero's creation, which is what Ariel is, has shockingly rebelled. To say back to Prospero, his artistic creator, the plot won't work in the way you want it to, and forgiveness must enter in. Prospero's own bafflement and uncertainty in the last scenes of The Tempest is very hard to stage in some ways. And of course there is that final extraordinary speech to the audience, which Prospero gives, inviting them to pray for him. And anybody who says that's just a conventional 17th century trope has not actually listened to those words. They are words of deep confusion and need. My ending is despair, unless I be relieved by prayer. So Prospero becomes, you might almost say, somebody who is Shakespeare's way of reflecting on exactly those problems of creating character, handling rebellion, turning away from puppetry. And it's no accident that at the end of the play, not only does Prospero bury his magic books and his magic staff, but hands the island over to the most disruptive and alien presence of all, Caliban, whom he's never wholly succeeded in taming. If you want a robust psychoanalytic interpretation of that, it's as if Prospero is saying, like everybody else, I have an id, and it needs somewhere to live. Well, I'd love to talk about Shakespeare for hours longer, but I need to wrap up a little bit and steer this back just for a few moments in conclusion towards some thoughts about the religious and spiritual dimension of all this. I want to suggest that all this has an impact on how we think about both creative freedom and created freedom. Created freedom is the freedom of beings within a system of exchange. Created freedom is never the freedom of an individual to have nothing constraining about them. It's the freedom to discover in conversation, in language, in exchange. And so our creative freedom is never just a matter of self-expression. It's a matter of listening as well as speaking, discovering how you're heard, how you're seen, and generating an imaginative world that can be shared. And if you want to be theological about it, this focuses what is distinct about created freedom. The freedom of the Creator, of God, is a freedom for which there is indeed no constraint. God is free to be God eternally and to do what God wants eternally, to love what God is eternally, to enact who God is eternally. That is God's freedom. Out of that freedom comes our own. But our problem is that so readily we confuse created freedom with the freedom of the creator. We would like to be in charge. We would like to be generating others who will voice what we are. And while the relationship of God to creation is one of total self-bestowal, not the control of one being by another, our relation within creation to other creatures so easily slips towards that obsession with controlling, scripting, determining the other. There's a whole further lecture to be given, I think, on the ways in which Shakespeare's drama gives us a number of characters whose evil lies precisely in their obsessive longing to script dramas for another, Iago and Othello and other examples. That is to suppose that any one of us can extricate ourselves from the interaction, the interrelation of being creatures. That any one of us can be like God, in a sense never intended by our Creator. The glory of our created freedom is its interdependence. The glory of God's freedom is something quite other. Let's not confuse the two. And to recognize the difference, the total self-bestowal of the Creator's freedom, is to recognize precisely what we cannot, without disaster, try to reproduce in our freedom with one another. We can't generate from ourselves what is truly other. That's what God does. What we can do is to recognize that if the other is generated by God, not by me, the other is not mine. The other is God's first. And therefore my obligation to listen and engage comes much more tightly into focus. But, nonetheless, we do have a created freedom. We can imagine a time that isn't ours and characters that are not us. We can, in developing the complex interactive conversations of others in their own time, we can learn something about what it is to let go of our aspirations for utter clarity and total control. T.S. Eliot says somewhere in Little Gidding that only through time is conquered. Perhaps we need to say something like that here. Only through drama is conquered. Our own passion to be dramatically in charge of others, writing their dramas in terms of our own needs and our own wants, maybe that's what needs chastening, challenging, reforming by the process of drama itself, where we see something of that deeply unexpected process by which, in trying to imagine ourselves out of our own control and out of our own comfort areas, we get some glimpse of what it is really to be a self in relation, growing together, sharing language. Thank you very much.